I feel fortunate to be going at the end, because I think the conversation that just began after the last talk on this different models of reality, essentially, and how we perceive things, East and West, and also within all the polarities and variations within what we think of as single realities, is very much what the world of alchemy in Burma is. So I sort of changed a little bit how I was planning to do this, and instead decided to do really, just because it is such an exotic world, and it in a way addresses so many different topics that we brought up in different contexts over the last couple of days, I thought I would just kind of give an overview of the sort of following William James's model and the varieties of alchemical experience in Burma, and perhaps look at how that reflects upon some of the different aspects that we've explored for Mercury in the context. So I haven't even gone through it once. Probably saw me madly trying to get, so we will see this. I'll just start though with this particular image on the front on the here is actually a living alchemist who was my main contact in Burma. He is Jaisempa Sayadaw, and it just again shows that, you know, within the Theravada Buddhist context of Burma, this completely sort of otherworldly, more magical dimension that alchemy certainly represents there, and that's what I will be speaking about. And dragons, as you'll see, come up simply because it's the term that's used among Burmese alchemists for directly translates as dragon's milk, the Burmese word. And this is from a series of 13th century copper plate inscriptions that are very beautiful, very poetic, and very different from, in a certain sense, any kind of common Buddhist context that we can think of. These were unearthed from a stupa that collapsed at an earthquake, and just roughly translated, because it, again, sort of introduces this kind of magical, alchemical world. A single ambrosial drop of dragon's milk confers the one taste of bliss, all aligned in body and mind, the inner constellation meshed with the outer stars and planets. The great synchronicity is achieved, neither inner nor outer, energy fluent, mind and body weightless, boundless, devoid of sorrow, all things bound together and free. So as you'll see, this kind of does in fact reflect a lot of what alchemy is seen at, within the being within a Buddhist context and yet somehow completely liberated from those constraints. I'm going to skip over some of the earlier parts of this because they've already been covered in far greater detail than I would be able to do them justice here. This was simply an introduction to Mercury, to the substance. Perhaps the image at the bottom is interesting because this is the symbol used in Burmese alchemy for dragon's milk, which is elemental mercury, with all their little flags and showing different stages in which the mercury then manifests. These, of course, and then of course looking at mercury use in different cultures, things we've all covered already in depth. Then the Mad Hatter. The hatting industry, of course, these are all things well known. And then Mercury as elixir, which in a way is the foundation for what is going on in terms of how alchemists in Burma perceive the purpose of their transformation of the metal. So with mercury consumption in Burma, Burma's location has there's a lot of mystery as to where the tradition actually originated. According to their own view, it's something that came to Burma in the 3rd century BC with a mission from Asoka. It came to a very specific site on the Mon coast, in the southeastern part of Burma, where supposedly the oldest and the first Buddhist monastery, Kelata, is based, and supposedly alchemy came at that time. And in their view, the physician who attended the Buddha was himself a practicing alchemist, and so the tradition goes right back and is deeply wedded with the whole alchemical Jivaka, yeah, exactly. So also though, Burma being extraordinarily rich in mineral resources, having cinnabar, unlike the Indian subcontinent, but like China does, was also both on a coastal route as well as on a land route between the two countries. And so there's also great reason to believe that the tradition was influenced both from China to the northeast as well as from India to the southwest, but developed its own particular forms just due to its own relative geographic isolation. This is perhaps the main center, certainly historically, of alchemy in Burma. This is Mount Popa, as it's more commonly known, and it's a series of temples on top of what's actually the volcanic bolt left over. So right when we think of Cinnabar, when we think of Mercury as being always associated with volcanoes, in a way it's perfectly emblematic of that, in that this temple would be literally built on what remained of an ancient volcano. There were colonial accounts of Mercury, the first time that Mercury was ever, people were aware of it even being used there. In 1882, Sir George Scott, who was so taken by Burma that he essentially renamed himself Shui Yo, wrote a book called The Burman, His Life and Notions, where he wrote that the Burmese have no more escaped from the craze of the discovery of the philosopher's stone than have any other civilized peoples. Even at the present day, there are numbers of goldsmiths and other handicraftsmen in the principal towns of Lower Burma who might be prosperous and happy did not the craving for the discovery of a means of making gold perpetually disturb their minds and impel them to waste their earnings in dabblings with mercury and strange-looking mineral and vegetable products. Mercury is what the experimenter always starts with. Every would-be discoverer commences his researches with mercury, and it is on this account a matter for congratulation that it is so expensive. Otherwise, we might have far more people doing damage to themselves and others than is even now the case. So this was the rather dismissive view taken at the sort of first colonial encounter with mercury use in Burma. The tradition, however, goes back to at least the 13th century, when the earliest mercury texts or alchemical texts were discovered. And these were inscribed copper plates dating back to 1257, although oral tradition, of course, claims that the practice goes back to 228 BC. And there's certainly other circumstantial evidence and accounts that it was certainly active in the 11th century in the Bagan region of central Burma as well. The cult of Mercury in alchemy is very, very linked in Burma to what are called the Nats, which are spirit entities that, in a sense, are almost intermediary between the spirit world and the human world. And in the 11th century, when King Anuwata basically tried to rid Burma of what we now call Burma, but the larger area that is now covered by Burma, and convert it to Theravada Buddhism, a lot of the reason for that was to get rid of what were called the Ari monks. And we know very little about who the Ari were. They were apparently monks who dressed in black. They drank, they gambled, they womanized, and practiced sorcery and certainly alchemy. So they were a rather wild bunch, clearly very tantric in disposition, if not by official affiliation. But we don't really know who they were. There's not really any solid research about the Ari. But in any case, they were forced to either leave, go underground, and the spirits, the Nats, were relegated to Mount Popa, the mountain that I showed you, built on the volcanic bolt. This is at a temple on that mountain there, where you have several of the 37 of the main Nats, and they're very connected to alchemy in the sense that people who often find Buddhism too remote to actually address their concerns and issues of everyday life will refer to the Nats, who are able to intercede in a more worldly way for their more immediate benefits. And the Nats are also very interesting in that there's a kind of shamanic dimension to them. People will often go into, even people who don't have that as a profession will often be possessed by the Nats, and the Nats will speak through them. And the alchemists themselves would enjoy the same status of being able to move freely between different dimensions. This is looking up from that particular temple to the specifically alchemical temples up on top of the mountain. Sorry, there's a staircase on the other side. It's still very steep. What's interesting in this whole Mount Popa area, here you have, which is Buddhist ostensibly, but you have here an image of the Buddha with monks, of course, revering him, but the alchemist, a very famous one from the 20th century, Bomingong, basically turning his back on the Buddha, which is in some ways a kind of emblematic of really what's happening in the tradition, why so much of alchemy in Burma, in a way, is kept still somewhat secret, because it does go against the very, very precepts of the Vinaya system. And with the Buddha basically forbidding monks to dabble in astrology, and palmistry, and alchemy. But here you had Bomingong, who is worshipped probably just as much. You see images of him, for example, in taxis in Rangoon, just as much as you see Buddhas sometimes. And as mentioned, the whole idea in alchemy is this idea of this dragon serpent energy. So, of course, we have the classic image of the Buddha and his enlightenment, with being hooded by and protected by you pronounce the name, Uchina, the giant multi-headed sort of serpent spirit who protected him, interpreted in different ways as kind of the rise of the Kundalini energy, of this primordial force within the body. And this relates very much, as we'll see later, to, in a sense, what happens when you imbibe dragon's milk, something that's both dangerous and extremely nourishing. The word milk being, of course, what's most nourishing, dragons being often what we think of as most dangerous. So the idea of bringing these two extremes together is really what the path of alchemy seems to represent. So here you have images in some of the old temples of a rishi, of a forest monk, negotiating with one of these nagas or dragons. Oops. And again, some of these outposts and centers of alchemical work, this is one near Bago, about 2 hours north of Rangoon. You'll see again the alchemist often holding in one hand a Mercury Bowl, and the other either a staff representing the dragon, in a sense controlling the energy of the depths, if you will, the chthonic force that the dragon represents, and the staff either being a symbol for being able to master that energy, and here actually in almost more clearly, almost like a serpent itself. You can think of that image from ancient Crete in a sense, with the wielding of the chthonic forces, of the control of the chthonic forces, and the snake and dragon representing, as it does in multiple cultures, this as being an intermediary between realms and worlds. This is an area called Punyin, which is one of the ancient centers of alchemy in Burma, although not so much so today, but still a place of great charge in a way, the caves that were used by the alchemists in the past. So you have everything from those traditional sites to some of these extraordinarily unusual alchemical shrines like this one, sort of made into a globe with the, you see on the sides, these are called zoji, which is the Burmese pronunciation of yogi, essentially, but very specifically referring in the context of Burma to alchemists, as we'll see later. This was my research assistant, who was a practicing alchemist and a retired professor of physics from the University of Rangoon. So as we'll see, the tradition carries through all levels of society, from traditional monks, as we see here at his forge, to another retired professor, gone into this sort of second incarnation now with his yogi, with the zoji staff. Here is the staff that the zoji carries, representing his ability, again, to move like a Hermes, essentially, like Mercury, to be able to move between dimensions. And that's very much what the intention and view is, that the path of alchemy allows us, is to escape not the wheel of life necessarily in that sort of classic Buddhist sense, but the single vision that constrains us to a more narrow range of experience than, which is, as they interpret it, essentially the source of our discontent. Whereas the path of the yogi allows for this more multi-dimensional experience of reality. These are some early Burmese alchemists who you see shrines to all over the country. Bobo Ong on the left, some of their distinctive sort of costumes, if you will, of the alchemists here in white, often with a red sash. Here are some others at another shrine near Bago. The one behind you see lounging. This is this very famous one from named Bomingong, who was instrumental during the 1930s and 40s in working towards independence from British rule. He believed, as the alchemists tend to, that the transmutation of material reality that's achieved within the laboratory has a reciprocal effect on the larger cosmos, on the larger reality. So there was very much this view that alchemists, with the correct orientation, would be working not just towards the perfection of the metals and of themselves, but also for the purification of the nation and its freedom from the contaminating influence of colonial rule. There are images, I couldn't find it today somehow, but there are actually images of General Aung San Suu Kyi's father, who was very instrumental, of course, in the whole process of freedom from British colonial rule, consulting with Bomingong and alchemists. So there is, as we'll see, also General Tan Shui, who was the head of this very devastating military regime, also very involved with alchemists. So it's something very deep within Burmese culture. This is an image, again, showing this intermingling within the Burmese psyche of Theravada monks, Buddhist monks, and alchemists in the foreground, dressed in white here at a particular cave called Nagamasa, which means the cave of the female dragon, which is located in Arakan state. Trying to get there, but it always seems to change location the closer you get to it. But the account is that this is the only place in Burma where you not only find cinnabar, but actually you have liquid mercury dripping from the cave walls, is sort of the view. And this is where the true alchemical immortals will go to seek their final resting place, if you will. Again, two images of two alchemists. Here you see a gong and a hammer in front. The idea is that when alchemists who have attained this certain level of realization, often when they die, they say that their body the body just vanishes. I mean, it's a bit like you have also in Tibetan tradition, not a rainbow body necessarily, but it's simply just, it's gone, one moment to the next, and that's the account. So they live in a kind of in an immortal light body in a place called Mahanyai, which is called the Great Forest, which I'll talk more about later. But here you see with the gong, the idea is that you actually can invoke although they were human beings, you still can invoke their presence. Contemporary Burmese alchemists, here are ones from, except for the one on the right, alive currently. The ones lower down, which we'll see more of later, holding in their hands these Mercury Bowls, which they use when they meditate. They don't actually hold them then, they actually put them under their tongues, which we'll talk more about. This is actually the ex-Minister of Health in Burma at his forge, where he's now a full-time practicing alchemist, and actually wrote a 500-page book on the practice of alchemy in Burma. Beautifully, painstakingly written. Twice I went to see him, pleading with him, because he's now in his 90s, to make a copy of it. What happens if this disappears? And of course it disappeared. So it no longer exists. It was all written in English. And said, get it published, whatever. And it was extraordinary because he has this deep, medical training background, and his view of Mercury is quite extraordinary. Which can be summed up by. When I first asked him about it, in Burma we're not frightened of Mercury. It's our friend. So here he is, of course, working with Mercury in his little crucible. These are his main teacher, which you saw up on up on this scroll, the painting up against, behind his forge, is the same person you see here. This is he's connected to a monastery in an area called Magwe in central Burma, where these they refer to them as immortals, because they're already supposed to be several hundred years old. And we'll talk about them later. But this is where he goes off now and stays in retreat. This is the one from Kelata. He's the abbot of what's considered to be the first monastery in Burma, first Buddhist monastery, here on his dragon throne with his staff. So again, this sense of how alchemy and this is him in a different context, in a state of mercuric meditative absorption. Oops, I've seen already. How did we get back to these? Okay, anyway, this is this area where I also did research called Desemba, and it's a whole mountain area known for its forest monks, like the one you see here, many of whom practice alchemy with mercury. And this is one, as you're walking along the paths, you'll suddenly have these little, hobbit-like, figures just appearing out of the bamboo forest. Extraordinary place. And like this, different from the monks who live in the monasteries, very designated by the very unusual headwear that they wear. I didn't really see where I began. I just want to make sure I'm not going.
Well, we're sort of, it's 5:10, and I think we're all happy to continue.
Okay, and just to be sure. This is an extraordinary alchemist here. He was a special forces soldier, very, very high up in the military regime. Killed many, many people, as he will recount. And has become the abbot of this hermitage in this forest area called Desemba. It's about an hour and a half walk through thick bamboo jungles and little streams, and you come to this kind of gilded temple where he's now holding a dragon's egg, and in front is a cup full of mercury. What's very, very interesting here, which we'll get to this. There's different variation in terms of how alchemy is practiced within these different areas. This is a woman, a female Waisar, as they're called, which means literally a woman of knowledge. The Waisar, again, is the Burmese expression of vidya, of knowledge holder. So they're essentially vidyadaras, alchemical vidyadaras, holders of knowledge. So it was by no means an exclusively male providence. There were many female alchemists known in the past. This is one who's very much still, she's a resident there at this particular hermitage, and this is where they do one of the forges that they have there outside the meditation hall. This is going back to Mount Popa, an alchemist there, holding his Mercury Bowl, which we'll talk about in due time. But showing again the variation in how these forges functions, most of which are done with bellows. Here, to save time, he's been able to set up a machine for it, so it sort of can be plugged in, and you can leave it somewhat unattended. Again, just to show the complete variation, this is someone who is an alchemist outside of Rangoon, who is also highly successful because of his ability to manufacture, to be able to, what they call, to catch and kill mercury, to turn it from liquid to solid. He's holding a mala, prayer beads that have been made from liquid mercury into solid mercury, supposedly, without the addition of any other metals. But we wouldn't be able to test that without buying it. It was about $5,000 if you wanted it. Again, the variation, this is a alchemist in Rangoon itself, very famous for his ability supposedly to be able to cure people of cancer and HIV. And here we have a pot of mercury. I was trying to back as far away as I could while his attendant is fanning the fire in the opposite direction. But this was a very elaborate process by which he creates this kind of gold ash, which is essentially, which its core ingredient being, of course, mercury. And then piles and piles of testimonies, supposedly, from people who have, and there were lines and lines of people lining up to see him, to be cured of incurable diseases through what is ostensibly a highly toxic substance. Again, this is the retired professor with his dragon staff indicating his designation as a alchemist. So you have every range of socioeconomic expression within the alchemical world, he being of obviously clearly substantial means. Again, General Aung San Suu Kyi's father, and I put this in because I couldn't find a picture of him consulting with Bomingong. And then General Tan Shui, this is the man who was responsible for keeping Burma at bay for the many decades that it was. But in the course of my research, I was fortunate enough to have patronage of sorts of a general's daughter who intimately knew the kind of inside operations of the regime and was close friends with General Tan Shui's second daughter, who apparently has gone into complete retirement in one of the many, many mansions that they own, as she's converted the whole downstairs of it into an artificial cave, a mercurial alchemy cave, and has devoted herself entirely to alchemical practice. And General Tan Shui, according to someone who directly works with him, never is without his Mercury Bowl in his pocket, which there are different ways you formulate them to achieve different ends, which we'll talk about in a bit. But again, just to show how Mercury and alchemy is part of every aspect. So it is essentially the prima materia of alchemy in Burma. This is solidified mercury, supposedly having been done without the addition. Although I didn't watch the process, not sure how it's done, but it sort of comes in these wonderful forms. This by a monk who is, let's see, the mercury ashes, the substances, the alchemical remedies are sold in traditional markets, such as you see here. The white one on the far right is all mercuric ash, for example. Unfortunately, this whole place is an old market in central Rangoon, all burned down a couple of years ago. This is before that happened. Another traditional shop, this one mostly filled with herbs, herbal products, but you see up on the shelf a lot of products that use mercury. And for practicing alchemists, not only can you get the remedies, but you can also get the ingredients that you need for your forge. So here you see crucibles on the right that are for sale in different sizes, where you would put the mercury in, then you put it in the forge, and we'll see that process in a bit. And then the different kinds of mineral substances and chemical substances that you would use according to your own recipe that you're engaged with at that time to achieve the transformation of your mercury bowl, as it's called a datlon, or an essence stone. This is a practicing alchemist shown here, who practices every day, with all of the discarded crucibles that he's been using in the ongoing quest to perfect the transmutation of the metal that, in a sense, mirrors the internal transformation that he's seeking within. This is that monk holding the transmuted mercury in his hand, and this is his workshop. Also, mercury used not only to create the mercuric essence stones that are used in different ways, as we'll see, but also to create religious Buddhist icons, such as you see here, a figure of an alchemist monk fashioned from mercury. And the crucible that this monk here is taking out from the forge. So the forge, of course, is the key piece of equipment. Here you see some old alchemical manuscripts on the left. You see from a monastery in Mebigong how around the monastery there were about 8 of these different forges set up so that the monks would be able to perform their alchemy when they had time off from their meditation and gathering in the chanting hall. One form of expression. Here again, the one I showed you before, who was able to fashion this prayer beads made from mercury at his particular forge, which is built above an auto mechanic shop, for example. So just showing the complete variation in how this is all achieved. Here again from a more contemporary alchemical text showing the way the bellows and the forge is used, and one on the right showing one, and with this idea that as we'll see in a bit, the transformation that occurs within the body, within the subtle body. Here you have the abbot of this hermitage at the Desempa place, at his particular forge. And again, the one at the monastery in Medigong, just to show again the variations and slight variations on design, but all with the central principle of having a bellows, and a forge. And here, after you've done the rite, which we'll see, you take out the crucible, you let it cool, and then you take out the mercuric ball and you examine it for signs. So all of this, of course, is for the idea of transforming mercury from a crude substance, a toxic substance, into one that not only can heal disease, but confer longevity, and particularly for those of that particular persuasion, used very much in a more transformative sense to, as they refer to it very specifically, to speed up the process of reaching nirvana. Here you see a pile of the mercury balls on the right, and the different molds that are used. But the idea in all of this, to be able to effectively transform the mercury, it's not just an entirely material process, but within the context of Burma, with its deep devotion to the path of meditation, and in a certain sense you can say to yoga in its sort of largest sense, is very much about putting your mind, projecting the mind into matter, in this case directly into the mercury, and recognizing this kind of affinity, or this sort of transubstantiation that occurs between ourselves and the metals that we are working with. So in this context, the bellows, let me go back actually, because what you're doing, as the abbot here is working, as he's pulling the bellows, each pulling of the bellows, he's doing what's called Strigoi Breath. It's a yogic breathing technique that literally means bellows breath. So he's actually altering altering consciousness, altering his focus, keeping his eyes deeply focused on the forge, projecting his mind into the mercury ball, seeing that as a projection of consciousness, while doing a breathing technique that's simultaneous with the control of a fire that's both internal and external. And then here again is the managing of the fire itself. You see the crucibles in the foreground, and the breathing continuing, so that you kind of go into this altered state. This is done not just in a monastic, or maybe more so in a setting like that, but you also have lay practitioners, such as this man who has an ordinary day job, but is an alchemist at home in the evenings. And monks in other locations, living in their kind of hermitages, but deeply devoted to this path, looking for material signs within the transmutation of the metals for an internal process of physiological and mental change within themselves. Here, again, the alchemists from Mount Popa having taken out and looking quite pleased with the results of, because each time you put your mercury ball in the forge, it comes out differently. The whole idea involved in this is what's called, they have the various stages of the alchemy, with the first one of which is called catching the mercury. And this is done, it's symbolized in the alchemical text using the Garuda, sort of a celestial hawk who catches the naga, catches the dragon. So here you see this actually on a temple strut with the celestial, if you will, hawk, Garuda, taming, catching the mercury, the chthonic force, if you will. So this whole idea of bringing together earth and heaven somehow within the body of the alchemist. So the mercury, these essence balls, as they're called in Burmese, dahlon, literally from dat, meaning essence or element, is always the way. Could you hand, I'm sorry, if you could hand me my leather bag there? I forgot to bring some. Great, thank you. But this is absolutely the essential ingredient for any alchemist, they must be devoted to producing their dalong. So I'll pass one around so you see what they are. These are various sort of substances. There are two here. This is a fragment of the solidified mercury. And then this is one of the dalong. It's made from, it's been put in the forge. The other one is the one not put in the forge. So I don't take any responsibility of how toxic these might be, but I can say I've handled them safely for years.
Which one?
So this is the one that's been put in, the round one is the one that's been put into the crucible, and this is the one that's been somehow solidified through the master's magic touch. But I don't know what that was, I didn't observe it. But in any case, here you see, and they're quite freely, they're not, they're very open about passing them around, about how there's being holding them. They're not precious in the sense that you can't let anyone else touch it. And as you can see, very much showing. Here again, you see monks at this one particular monastery where all the monks practice alchemy, each one showing their Mercury Bowl. And I made this one using their technique, yeah, because there wasn't really any way to sort of get deeper into this without having to sort of take on the role of a novice alchemist. So, sorry? It's mercury, and then they put, again, the teacher will always say that they look at it, they examine it, and they say what chemicals you have to put in the next time. So that's always, it's very experimental, it's non-formulaic in a certain sense, and eventually you're supposed to reach the point where you know yourself what you do. So you're working a lot with intuition. I mean, I was just following directions. But what's interesting, what they do at this monastery, when they meditate and they do their vipassana, they take their Mercury Bowl, they put it under their tongue, and they say they can go into much deeper states of meditation. So what we know from cinnabar, of course, is that it does have, according to tradition and pharmacopoeia, this ability to tranquilize the mind, to strengthen the heart, and so perhaps I tried to avoid this whenever possible, but this is what they do with it, and they all seem quite healthy. Here again, showing it before he pop it into his mouth. And what's interesting, as the practitioner becomes more advanced, the Mercury Bowl begins to transform, and it eventually, this is one where not the person you see on the left, but his master basically had, it was basically a solar and a lunar Mercury Bowl, if you will. And they became like eyes. And people would come from all over, and what he would do is take these, he'd put them in water for a few seconds, and people would drink the water, and they'd be cured of any disease they might have been suffering from. That was the idea. And this was through this gold and silver, very eye-like. And it became almost, I think the other day, I forgot who was speaking, but this idea of where it becomes solid, but also strangely translucent. It sort of begins to take on a kind of a substance and a quality that we can't really describe so easily. But you'll see these dalong, they're everywhere in Burma. Here you see in a monastery an alchemist holding in his hand one of these essence bowls, the dalong. You'll see in the Shwedagon temple, in the center of Rangoon, an alchemist holding up his dalong. They are absolutely, and here again at a temple of the Nats, holding up the Mercury Bowl. So this is, and eyeing it in a very interesting way where, you know, as you look at it, it basically functions in a certain sense as a kind of circular mirror, if you will, because in a way what is happening is our own consciousness is projected into the matter, and it reflects back in a certain sense where we are, and so the whole idea is that you overcome this kind of subject-object duality through this intimate connection that you develop with Mercury. Some of this is actually the dalong, the Mercury Bowl that belonged to Bo Minggong, this very famous alchemist who lived up until the 1950s.